Uta. I'm just trying to spotlight Uta too. I'm sorry. Here we go. Uta and Julia work both in the advocacy project of the Uisg. Uta is the project coordinator and Julia is the communication officer of the advocacy project. If you remember well, we had a webinar on the same issue, more or less, in last year to learn how to speak in public, so public speaking, but also how to manage a good interview with press.
Excuse-moi, seulement, si, merci pour la traduction en espagnol, ça va.
Merci Thérèse. Nous avons toujours des problèmes avec la technique, mais merci Thérèse. So today is a workshop, so is a second meeting on how to go more in depth, not only in public meeting, but also communicate for advocacy, which is wider. And Julia will help us to understand also what advocacy is, and she will tell us more about the project. So it will be a real workshop, 2 hours enough intense. So thank you, Julia. Julia is a colleague, but it's also a friend. She's Italian and English. She has both citizenships, and she also speaks many other languages. So she's really a woman of the world. Mm-hmm. Welcome, and thank you for helping us to communicate better for advocacy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrizia, and thank you all for joining us today. It's wonderful to see so many people here. I know some of you were here last time, back in December, and as Patrizia was saying, the idea today is to go more in depth. So we'll take a more in-depth look at some of the kind of theory, some of the conceptual questions around what advocacy is and why we do it, but we'll also have the chance to go more in depth in a practical sense. As Patrizia said, this is a real workshop, so we'll have the chance to practice some skills and learn from each other as well, which is really the idea of today. So without further ado, I'm going to start my presentation. There we go. Wonderful. Hopefully everyone can see that. And Patrizia, just give me a shout if I'm speaking too fast for the translators or if anything else comes up on the technical side. So today we're here to talk about communicating for advocacy. And the aim of this workshop is to discuss how to speak in the public arena and why. Now, looking at how we're going to run this session, we're actually going to start from the why. We're going to do it the other way around. So we're going to talk a bit about the why of public speaking. And in order to get to grips with that why, we're going to look at two things specifically: what advocacy means at Uisg, what it means as part of this project, and also we're going to look at advocacy as ministry, what it can mean in a broader sense, what it can mean within the day-to-day context of our ministry. Then we're going to have our first breakout session, a warm-up breakout, a chance to get to know people in smaller groups. And then we're going to move on to part two, the how of public speaking. So some more practical ideas, some concrete tips for speaking in the public arena. Then we'll have a chance to ask some questions and another breakout session and a chance really to practice some public speaking in smaller groups, which is the aim of the session today. So starting from the why of public speaking, let's have a look at what advocacy means for Uisg. And as part of this project, advocacy is a word which is sometimes used quite nebulously. We use it and we're not quite sure what we're talking about. So let's have a look at what it means to us. The Uisg advocacy project, which was launched in July last year, is called Sisters Advocating Globally. Now, I just wanted to pause for a moment to think about the difficulty of using an icon to represent the word globally. Of course, the irony of any icon that represents the globe is that it only ever represents a part of the globe. So I sat here for 10 minutes thinking, which part of the world am I going to show in my icon representing the concept of globally? And eventually I picked this one because I'm in Europe. But one of the things that we want to do as part of this project is unpick some of these concepts. Often we talk about globally and we really mean the global north, or we talk about globally and we're coming from a certain kind of cultural or social situation that we're not really aware of, that we're not taking into consideration. So Sisters Advocating Globally is the title of the project. And I wanted to read together the Uisg Advocacy Vision Statement, which you have here below. This is the statement that we've come up with, that we worked with together on kind of defining, so that we know what we mean when we talk about advocating at Uisg. And the statement says, "We are your sisters. We are committed to advocating for you and together with you, sharing a journey of care for people and for the environment. We believe in a world where everyone experiences a sense of human dignity. And we build our mission on evidence from our work on the ground, inspired by our reflection on the gospel message, the church's social teaching, and the leadership of Pope Francis." So in order to have a more in-depth look, as Patrizia was saying, at what that means, we're going to unpack the first 6 lines of that statement to kind of reflect together on what it means to do advocacy in this particular way. So the first line of our statement says, "We are your sisters." And this line encapsulates something crucial about advocacy at Uisg, which is that for us, advocacy is relational. And when we say we are your sisters, we're immediately locating ourselves in relation to someone. And that someone really are the local communities that sisters serve all around the world. So this sense of relationality is crucial to advocacy, is something that we've tried to illustrate with the 2 campaigns that we've run up to this point. Some of you may be familiar with these campaigns, may have seen them online or taken part. One campaign was called "You Are My Sister." And this campaign aimed to highlight the amazing work that sisters everywhere have been doing to support local communities through the pandemic. And the other, the more recent campaign, was called "Sisterhood Works." And you can see here we have a great quote from Sister Jessica, who I think is with us today, who said, "As the COVID-19 pandemic goes on, we realized we could not be indifferent to what is happening in the world." So this campaign, again, aimed to highlight what sisters have been doing during the pandemic, but also more generally to support communities in need. And both these ideas, "You Are My Sister" and "Sisterhood Works," kind of revolve around relationality. Who do we work for? Who do we work with? Who do we work near? So relationality is really the first line and the key piece of our advocacy vision statement. Now, we are committed to advocating, and here is the key question that you often find yourself coming back to, or at least I often find myself coming back to when I talk about advocating. What does it mean to advocate? What activity is that? Well, we've come up with 5 pillars of advocacy, 5 activities which to us describe the kind of core elements of advocacy. One is research, so gathering information, gathering data, gathering stories, witnesses, testimonies. And this is a key part of advocacy, and it's built into our statement again later on when we say we build our work on evidence from the ground. That's what we're doing, really incorporating that element of research, of knowledge. Pillar 2 is policy making. So the this speaks more to the aim of advocacy. The aim of advocacy is to create long-term structural change, and often the way to do that is at the policy level. So an activity, an aim of advocacy can be to influence, to create, or to change policy, to change laws, regulations around certain issues. Number 3, alliance building. And again, this one is a really crucial part of advocacy in general and of what we're doing as a project. Advocacy is also about connecting with the people who want to create the same type of change. It's about kind of working together so that we become more than the sum of our parts. It's about creating those networks, creating those partnerships so that people who want to see the same type of change in the world are working together, coordinating their efforts. Number 4, it's about mobilization and empowerment. And empowerment is something we'll talk about a bit more in detail, but it's kind of, the idea of mobilization and empowerment is an idea that revolves around enabling people to speak up for themselves. Sometimes it's our turn to speak up for others who are unable to speak up for themselves in that moment, but ultimately what we want to do is mobilize and empower those who need to speak up for themselves. And finally, the 5th pillar is what we're here to talk about today, communication. Sharing what we know, sharing what we learn, what we see, what we believe, what we experience. Communication is such a key part of advocacy because, as we were saying, advocacy is all about kind of that relationship with the people we serve, but also with the people we want to influence, with the people we want to partner with. So we are committed to advocating for you and together with you. What does it mean to advocate for and with? Well, the way we've come to describe that is as a process of opening the door and then holding it open, holding space for others to come into the room. And this is kind of what I was getting to when we were beginning to think about empowerment. Sometimes we need to advocate for a marginalized group or for a certain community, so we are opening that door. But other times it's their turn to come into the room. And it's important that in that 2-step process, we always have that ultimate aim in mind. I've really been thinking about this 2-part process in the last couple of days. And I think there's another analogy as well, which is kind of a good way to describe it. Imagine that you're sitting in a room full of people and you're sitting next to someone who is too shy, too timid to speak up, or maybe doesn't speak the right language. So you stand up and you speak for them, and that's a valuable and courageous thing to do. But ultimately, when you stand up and speak for them, you're also blocking them. You're blocking them from seeing the audience, from seeing the rest of the room, and you're blocking them from being seen. So at some point, the courageous and valuable act of speaking up, standing up to speak, has to give way to sitting down again and kind of empowering others to stand and to speak. So how do we do this? How do we open the door and then make sure that we keep it open, hold that space for those who need to speak for themselves? Well, we think about the type of language that we use, and this is where we really come to the importance of communication. We want our language to be empowering, focusing on giving people a hand up and not just a hand out that keeps them stuck in the same place. We want our language to be inclusive, things like gender, race, religion, and we want our language to be nuanced. We want the way that we communicate to be nuanced, attentive to holding in balance different ideas that kind of contribute different things, that complement each other. And we'll talk about this a bit more when we look at how we hold in balance, for example, works of charity and works of justice. We'll look at that later on. So we are committed to advocating for you and with you, sharing a journey of care. And that's really how we would describe the work that sisters do and the place that we come from when we advocate. And we would articulate that journey of care in 3 different connected stages: presence, encounter, and service. Now, presence is a really interesting point because it's something that sisters bring very uniquely into the space of global development, something that really sets sisters apart in a good way from the global development community. Sisters live side by side with local communities and not by the airport, as I once heard somebody describe it. Often, organizations working in the humanitarian sphere arrive with the best of intention in the midst of a crisis, and they set up a camp and they start their wonderful work, but they don't have that presence. They have not already been living side by side with the local community. So that's something really special that sisters bring to the table, a really special way of starting out on this journey. The second step is about encounter, meeting people where they are, as Pope Francis is always telling us. And there's really three key elements there for us: respect, solidarity, and collaboration. Respect for human dignity, solidarity with the marginalized and vulnerable, and collaboration with all people of goodwill. And again, that means inclusivity. Sometimes that means people of goodwill who don't come from the same place or exactly the same culture, but who are willing to work with us in that alliance to create the change that we want to see in the world. And thirdly, service. And how do we perform that service? The way we've come to describe it is inclusive, integrative, and integral. Inclusive, we leave no one behind. Integrative, we bring people together and motivate others to move forward. And integral, in the sense of holistic, studying the root causes of a problem and seeking long-term solutions. And again, a key element of advocacy, which we've mentioned and will mention again, is kind of that sense that we're aiming for systemic change, not just to fix the problem today, not just to help one person, but to look at the problem holistically and create long-term systemic change. And finally, our journey of care is for people and for the environment. And we've articulated that into three main areas for the purposes of this project. So the idea is that this project will support sisters who are advocating, particularly in one of these areas or several of these areas: healthcare, human trafficking, and integral ecology. And I just wanted to take a break from chatting myself and read a passage that's really of great inspiration to us when we think about how we hold those two things in balance: care for people and care for the environment, from the encyclical letter Laudato Si. The human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. For example, the depletion of fishing reserves especially hurts small fishing communities without the means to replace those resources. Water pollution particularly affects the poor who cannot buy bottled water, and rises in the sea level mainly affect impoverished coastal populations who have nowhere else to go. The impact of present imbalances is also seen in the premature death of many of the poor, in conflicts sparked by the shortage of resources, and in any number of other problems which are insufficiently represented on global agendas. So the final point that I wanted to highlight is this sense that human and natural care, that the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together or flourish together. And that's the way that we see these different strands of advocacy as intersecting. We know that care for the planet is care for the people, and vice versa. So now that we've had a look at what advocacy is at Uisg, I wanted to talk about advocacy as ministry. And I'm going to use a few quotes. Many of them come from conversations that we've had recently with sisters and which have been of great inspiration to us. So when we think about advocacy as ministry, one thing that we've realized from conversations with sisters is that there's a general sense that advocacy lives in a box. It lives in a pigeonhole. And if that's your ministry, then you do advocacy. But if it's not, then you don't do advocacy. And that's the assumption that we really want to question. So there's this great quote: sisters are trained to understand only one topic, depending on their mission. It's like they're sitting in a closed room and can't see the rest of the house. Although we are sisters, we are part of society. And I found this really inspirational because it really gives that idea of locating advocacy within a broader context. So the idea that we really want to get across and that we really want to share is that advocacy can be part of any ministry. What does it mean to advocate wherever you are? Well, you might work in a school, for example, and advocacy would be speaking to the school's board of governors about a change that you might be able to suggest that makes life easier for children who are on free school meals. Or you might work in a hospital and you might know that they have some great learnings from their emergency department at the hospital across the road, and you might convene a working group to share those learnings, to share those ideas, to brainstorm solutions. Anything that you can do in the place where you are to kind of gather information and channel it towards alliance building and systemic change, anything can be advocacy, really, if you're thinking about change at that systemic kind of networked level. So that's really the first thing that we're here to reflect on, is how sometimes we don't realize that we're doing advocacy because it's not what we're specialized in, but we might be doing it without knowing. And other times we think, oh, I'd love to do advocacy, but I don't have time, I don't have the resources, I'm not able to dedicate myself only to that. Now, one of the aims of this project is also to kind of encourage congregations and superiors to allocate more resources, more energies, more staff to advocacy activities. But the thing that we really want to focus on today is you don't need to be an advocate 24/7. You don't need to be dedicated exclusively. You don't need to be in the advocacy box. You can be an advocate wherever you are. And that's my next point, advocate anywhere. Now, this quote is not from a sister, it's actually by a musician who I really like, and it's about teaching. So, full disclosure, my background is in education as well as communication. I kind of think that education is communication and communication is education, so that's what I've always done. And I love this quote. It's inviting people to be teachers. And he says, be a teacher. Please, please be a teacher. You don't have to do it forever, but if you're in doubt about what to do, be an amazing teacher. Just for your 20s, be a primary school teacher. And even if you're not a teacher, be a teacher. Share your ideas, rejoice in what you learn, and spray it. And I love that image. I love the idea that we can rejoice in what we learn, in what we know, in what we've experienced, and spray it, share it with the world. And I think that really encapsulates, in a way, the kind of advocacy that we want to encourage. You don't have to do it forever. Do it for a while. Do it when you have time, when you're able to, even if you can't commit indefinitely. Rejoice in what you know and share it. Be an advocate. Another key point around advocacy as ministry is the question of global solutions. We live in such a globalized world, in a world where all the challenges that we face and that are faced by the most marginalized and the most vulnerable, all those challenges are interconnected. We've seen already how environmental challenges are connected with social challenges, but really there's that geographical sense as well, that challenges in the US are connected to challenges in Europe, which are connected to challenges in Asia. And this is a quote from a sister we spoke to who is in Latin America, and that's why I've chosen the Americas as my global icon this time. And she said, since human trafficking crimes and networks are transnational, our networks must also be transnational. We need organized sisters to fight organized crime. And I love that idea of a powerful worldwide gang of sisters. But I think she makes a really interesting point, which is, you know, and she's speaking about human trafficking crimes and networks here, but I think this is true of any challenge. She makes the point that all challenges are transnational. And so, you know, those of us who are kind of fighting for change, for progress on those challenges, we must also work transnationally. A couple more points. So coming back to charity and justice and how we hold those things in balance. One of the sisters we spoke to, who is in Asia, said to us, sisters are focused on being holy, merciful, obedient, but advocacy requires us to own our ideas. We want to help our neighbours, but we're not empowered to address the root causes of their problems. We want to work on a model that's not just about needing and giving, but a more sustainable model. Now, I think this is a really interesting, I think this raises a really interesting question. As we were just saying a moment ago, the Catholic Church has this incredible kind of unique selling point, if you like, although that's the wrong word, but it kind of has this incredible position, this incredibly privileged position when it comes to works of charity. And that's something that I've seen, having worked previously with lay NGOs, for example. I've worked a lot in the humanitarian sector, both in the Catholic world and outside of it. And one thing that's unique and valuable and incredibly admired about the way that sisters and the way that the church more broadly responds to humanitarian challenges is its incredible capacity to be there when charity is needed. So if you're working with an NGO and there's a disaster, a typhoon or an earthquake or, you know, another kind of humanitarian crisis somewhere, there's a time lag, there's a delay often there's a delay in seeking the funding for a project to address those needs, and then you don't have presence on the ground. So there's another delay that's more logistical around kind of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. I've seen that firsthand. And the church and sisters particularly have this incredible presence and this incredible kind of capacity to respond immediately with charity wherever it is needed. So that's something valuable not to be lost, and in fact something to be kind of loudly celebrated. But at the same time, the question is, how do we balance that with also positioning sisters, particularly, which is part of what this project wants to do, positioning sisters as advocates for justice? How do we go beyond the charity, which is still to be valued and celebrated, and look as well at sustainable change? As the sister was saying, a model that's about more than needing and giving, that's about addressing the root causes of a problem and kind of creating long-term change. So I think that's a communication challenge which I find fascinating and which we've been grappling with at Uisg for the last 9 months. How do we communicate in a way that highlights and kind of equally highlights the importance of both those aspects? And finally, confidence. I think this is a really kind of important aspect of advocacy as ministry. Yes, it requires some confidence to advocate. It requires some confidence to speak up. It requires some confidence to perhaps speak to a new audience. But the fun thing about advocacy is that it creates a loop of positive feedback. The more you advocate, the more confident you feel. And this is a quote by a sister in Ireland, who I have a feeling is also with us today. Hello, Sister Eilish, if you're there. And she said, "I can only do what I can with the gifts that I have. I have to believe that my gifts are no lesser than anyone else's. And that's really what advocating is about, because so often that kind of reluctance to step into the advocacy arena can be about confidence and can be about fearing that our gifts are somehow lesser than the gifts of others. But we all have some way in which we can speak up, in which we can speak out. Maybe it's writing, maybe it's public speaking, maybe it's liaising with the media, maybe it's networking, maybe we're great at talking to strangers, and that's how we create the connections that slowly build a network of like-minded advocates for change. Whatever it is that you're good at, and we're all good at something, there is a way to channel it towards advocacy, and we really believe that. Now, of course, advocacy brings its own challenges as well. What are the challenges, the key difficulties that we might face as we step into the advocacy arena? Well, the first and perhaps one of the more immediate challenges that we might face is speaking out without alienating our audiences. So, for example, when we talk about charity and justice, I think that's a really key example. The church is very well known, and sisters are incredibly well known for the charity work that they do. But to talk about justice might be seen as threatening by some. So how do we speak out in new ways to new audiences on new issues without alienating the people who have been listening to us so far? Because really, there's no point opening yourself up to a new audience if the people who were listening to you before turn around and say, oh, well, I'm not interested in her now that she does that. So that's a very difficult, very tricky balance to strike. And that balance is not just about the way we come across our audiences, but it's also about the way that we feel. It's also about our identity, our position. It's also an internal reflection. How do we translate our message while retaining our essence? So if we decide that we're going to go and talk about the work that we do in a new arena, for example, with a local politician or with an NGO who might partner with us on the work that we do, when we go and translate our message, which we have to do in order to be understood by a new audience, how do we hold on to the things that are the core of our identity, of ourselves? Thirdly, a challenge, of course, exists around kind of building the platform to advocate on and owning the spotlight. So how do we build the platform? How do we access the spaces where advocacy happens? How do we build credibility in those spaces? And how do we own the spotlight? How do we prepare for unintended consequences? How do we know that we're ready to advocate in those spaces? Those are all questions that we might want to think about. And finally, the question of relationships. So there's a key point around knowing our allies, making sure that we have that strong network when we go into a new space, making sure that we're backed up by the people, the organizations who can be our allies, but also knowing our frenemies. I don't know if you've heard the word frenemies before, but it's basically friends who can sometimes be enemies. And I think in advocacy and generally within the arena of international development, this is a really key point, and actually in the arena of public speaking as well. Sometimes there might be partners, there might be actors, there might be stakeholders, whatever we want to call them, who can be on our side, can help us further our aims, but have their own agenda as well. They're not totally friends because their agenda doesn't always align with ours. They're not enemies either because we can work with them towards a common goal. But how do we identify and how do we juggle, how do we kind of hold in balance those situations where a particular organization or a particular partner or a particular person is allied with us on some issues, but not on others, in some ways, but not in others. I think that's a very key point in this arena. So I'm going to pause my presentation because we're nearing the end of part 1 and it's nearly time for a breakout session. But first, I would love to come back to the main session, and I would love you all to write in the chat what advocacy is to you in 1 word or 2 words or 3 words, but a very short description of what advocacy might mean to you, given everything that we've talked about in the last half hour. What is advocacy? How would you describe it now? I'm going to open the chat and I'm going to read a few ideas. Oh, power, I love that. Advocacy is power, is empowerment, yes. Standing up, making a stand, making a clear stand, yes. Advocacy is life, I love that. Fearlessness, oh, so nice. To give voice, so many coming in, I can't read them all. Speaking out, solidarity, sharing what we believe, empowerment, possibility, yes. Influence, ooh, dejar ser, I like that, allowing people to be. Compromiso, yes, commitment, empowerment, to take a position, transformation, yes, I love all of these words, and I'm so glad that we'll have the transcript and can use these later on to reflect. Flexibility, yes. Influencing transformation structurally, absolutely. Commitment to transformation, yes. Advocacy it's about a change for sure. It's about a journey to stand for a cause, to care, to have confidence, to support, to defend. Ooh, cercanía, yes, proximity, closeness. I like that. To listen, that's a very interesting point, of course, and one that we haven't touched on today because there's so much to talk about. But of course, to communicate and to communicate for advocacy is first of all to listen, to hear, especially if you're going to speak for someone else. Yes, to promote living together, to be close to, connect, collaborate. Ooh, dar la palabra, yes, also to kind of give voice, right? To kind of hand the microphone to someone else. Dialogue, empowerment. These are all fantastic. Thank you very much. This is so fun. I should I should have tried this before. It's the first time I'm trying this, but I really enjoy it. So thank you, everyone. So I'm going to go back to my presentation and we're going to take a look at what's going to happen in the breakout groups, which we're about to go into. Now, before I do that, Patrizia, can you confirm that we're ready for the breakout groups? So we, on the technical side, good to go?
We are partially ready because there are a lot of people who didn't rename themselves. So when we start the group, they risk to lose part of the group. And also we have to, for this session, the group will be 5 and they will have 15 minutes. So I invite the people who didn't rename themselves to rename themselves.
Yes, so let me talk about what's going to happen in the breakout sessions. I'll quickly share my presentation again. And while I do this, it would be brilliant if, as Patrizia said, you can either rename yourself on Zoom, adding the language that you want to be working in to the start of your name. You can see lots of people in this session have already done that. They've added EN for English, ES or ESP for Spanish. So if you want to do that, you can do that now. And while you do that, and while Patrizia keeps working on splitting us up into groups, I'm going to go back to my presentation and we're going to have a look at what's going to happen in this first breakout session. So what's going to happen is we're going to take 5 minutes to reflect. And you can take some notes, you can kind of do that reflection in silence or in writing or however you prefer. And I would love you to think about an advocacy activity that you're involved in. It could be something that you've done in the past, something that you're doing in the present, or something that you'd like to do or develop in the future. And I would love for us to think here about especially those things, as we were saying, that we didn't realize might constitute advocacy, those day-to-day activities which actually might have an advocacy component, might have an advocacy element. The breakout groups will include maximum 5 people. That will depend a bit on how many people we have available for each language, but you should be 4 or 5 people in a group. And once we've gone into the groups, you'll have 15 minutes. So about 3 minutes each to present if there's 5 of you. And the idea is just to share what you've been doing or what you would like to do and how you think that connects to this concept of advocacy, to this idea of advocacy that we've been sharing. On the right-hand side here, you can see that I've copied our 5 pillars of advocacy: research, policy making, alliance building, mobilization and empowerment, and communication, in case it's helpful to think concretely what activities we're talking about. So check that you have your language stated in your Zoom name. And if you want as well, you can take notes on these instructions or just take a quick screenshot, take a quick photo with your phone, because you won't be able to see this screen once we go into the groups. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes, so you can start your reflection now if you haven't already. I'm in 2 or 3 minutes time, we should be ready for Patrizia to activate the groups. Patrizia, give us the thumbs up whenever you're ready. We'll give it.
Yes, I think I'm ready more or less.
Okay.
There are other people outside, but we will include it later. Okay.
I'm going to mute my microphone and give 3 minutes of reflection in silence so that I'm not disturbing anyone.
Julia, sorry, I think I will send the people to the group right now. They can start in 3 minutes, so I have time to include the people who couldn't rename themselves. Okay.
That's great. Okay, so sorry, one more time. If anyone wants to see these instructions, take a picture now, because when you go into your groups, you won't be able to see them. So make a note of the 5 pillars of advocacy. Think about what activities you're involved in, which really speak to advocacy in that way. And yes, Patrizia is going to give us the go ahead.
Yes, Julia, I think that the interpreter should write in the chat the translation of the 5 of the list of 5 elements, if you don't mind, the interpreter, so people can take a photo of the chat. Otherwise, it's not useful for the people who do not understand English. Okay.
Yes, sorry, thank you.
No, it's okay. So I will put 18 minutes for the group, okay? Because we include 2. Okay. So the group will start, and the people, if the people are...
Keep going. So one thing that surprised you, we'll come back to that later. We were going to take a little break, but we'll carry on and maybe have the break before the breakout sessions at the end. So now that we've talked about the why of advocacy, so what advocacy is at Uisg and what advocacy can be as part of our ministry.
Scusami Giulia, vorrei fare una prova, perché se non partono il problema, allora è inutile che li ripreparo. Faccio soltanto una prova.
Sorry, Giulia.
No, infatti non partono. Quindi li faccio fare a Therese, perché a questo punto...
No,
Therese
groups actually don't start. So please, Therese, please, I'm going to give you back the host. Where are you? With which PC can I find you? Okay, so Giulia, please go on.
Okay, no, hopefully later. So we will keep going, get through the presentation and see if we can split up into smaller groups further on. So now that we've had a look at the why of advocacy, it's time to think about the how of communicating for advocacy. So those of you who were with us at the session in December will remember that we talked a lot about intention, knowing your intention when you speak publicly, and knowing your message, knowing what you want to communicate and making sure that you're not thrown off course, that you're not distracted. Now, that's very true and very important, and it was particularly relevant to the subject of our session in December, which was speaking to the media. But I'd like to bring in another element today and look at kind of how we balance these two elements. The other element is empathy. So yes, when we communicate in the public arena, when we communicate for advocacy, it's important to be centered, to be focused on our own message, on what we want to get across, what our intention is for that particular communication. But it's also crucial and can be more or less crucial depending on the particular type of public speaking. It's also crucial to balance that intention with empathy. And by empathy, we mean an understanding of who our audience is, what they want to hear, what they're interested in, what they can invest in emotionally or concretely, what they can get on board with, what initiatives will inspire them. All of those things constitute empathy when it comes to communication. And so I think in general, it's crucial to balance those two elements. And I think it's crucial as well to think about how we balance them differently depending on the type of communication that we're looking at. So as we were saying back in December, if we're speaking to the media, if we're talking about a radio interview, for example, we might want to be stronger on our intention. And why is that? Well, because of course, in the case of a radio interview, we have an interviewer, a journalist sitting in front of us, and that person is a very good example of a frenemy, someone who can be our friend, but can also be our enemy. They can be our ally. They're giving us a platform, an opportunity to speak, but their agenda is not necessarily 100% aligned with ours. They might want to get an angle on the story that we don't agree with. They might want to get a controversial quote from us that we don't want to give. So in the case of a radio interview or any engagement with the media, really, it's crucial to be perhaps a little more focused on our intention, our message, and not to get sidetracked by difficult questions. We'll have a look at how we avoid difficult questions more concretely in just a moment. Somewhere in the middle, we might have an activity like a project presentation. You have a new idea, you want to share it with someone who can help you realize that idea, whether that's, for example, a superior who can allocate time and resources, a funder who can allocate some money, a partner who can join the initiative. I think in the case of a project presentation, it's fair to say that we want to locate ourselves somewhere in the middle of that spectrum between intention and empathy. Know what we want, but also know what the audience might want or might be interested in, and find that place where our agendas, where our interests overlap. That's really where the magic happens in that particular type of communication. Or we might be planning something like a campaign. It could be a campaign online, on social media, a newsletter campaign, an advertising campaign on a bus or in schools. It could be anything. But with a campaign, what we really are trying to do is not just communicate our message, but also engage a certain audience. And in that case, we really do have to move further towards the empathy end of the spectrum. So this is the situation where we might be doing some market research or kind of doing some polls, conducting some, sending out some questionnaires, for example, to find out what is it that our audience is interested in and how can we design this campaign so that, yes, of course, we stay true to the essence of what we want to communicate, what our intention is, but also importantly, perhaps a little more importantly in this case, we really communicate in a way that's exciting, that's engaging to the audience we want to reach, and that motivates them to participate in whatever we want them to do. So I think as we think about the how of communicating for advocacy, I think it's important to note that how we communicate will differ depending on the type of communication, the type of activity. And I think this idea of a sort of intention to empathy spectrum can be really useful as a guideline in terms of where we locate ourselves, where we start the journey of communication. Now, let's get to some concrete tips. And those of you who were with us in December will recognize some of this, but I think with this kind of practical guidance, it's always useful to have a refresher, because these are things that are kind of easy to talk about and then difficult to remember when it actually comes to communicating, when it comes to public speaking. I find them difficult to remember too, because when it comes to public speaking, often we can be overwhelmed by the adrenaline. Speaking publicly can be very exciting, can be a little nerve-wracking, and it's very difficult to bear in mind that kind of structure of preparation that we might have theoretically been studying and be ready to put in place. So when we prepare for public speaking, there are two really key elements that we want to think about. One is the result that we want to achieve, and the other is the impression that we want to make. So what is the result that we want to achieve? Well, again, we have these key questions. Who do you want to reach? Who's your audience? What do you want them to know? What's your message, your intention? And what do you want them to do? How can you, again, engage them, invite them to participate, motivate them to remember what you said and perhaps to act upon it as well? And in terms of making an impression, again, a few key questions that we can ask are, how do I want to come across? This sounds like an obvious question, but actually I think it bears some scrutiny, because just like intention and empathy can be balanced differently in different situations, the impression that we want to make might also be different in different situations. So if I'm going to speak to a journalist who I know has a reputation for asking some very tough questions, maybe I want to come across a bit less friendly and a bit more self-contained. I'm not saying intimidating, but if this is someone who is likely to try and intimidate me, the impression that I want to make is certainly a strong one, a firm one. If, on the other hand, I'm communicating with someone who's likely to feel maybe a bit nervous about meeting me, then of course I want to make the opposite impression. Depending on the situation, I might want to come across as extremely friendly, very approachable, very open, but all of those things can vary depending on the situation. And really, when we think about how we want to come across, I think what I'm trying to say is a key element of communication is also reflecting on power. Do I have, what kind of power do I have in relation to the person that I'm communicating with? Do I need to set them at ease, or do I need to hold my own? Do I want to open a space for them, or am I trying to assert a space for myself, create a space for myself or for others? Those questions about power, those reflections on power dynamics, I think are a crucial part of preparing the impression that we want to make. And then other things that we might want to reflect on when we think about the impression that we're preparing to make. What do I need to remember? What are the really key things that I need to remember about this situation? If there's 3 things that I'm going to take with me into this event, into this workshop that I'm presenting, what are those 3 key things? And what do I want to avoid? And we'll talk a bit more about avoiding difficult questions, but I might also want to avoid seating next to each other 2 people who I know don't agree when I'm convening a meeting of partners. Or, it doesn't have to be something that I want to avoid saying. It could also be something that I want to avoid doing. So once I've thought about achieving a result and making an impression, the really key thing, I think, when it comes to that moment of communicating is the connection. How do I create that connection with the person that I'm speaking to that makes me memorable and engaging, that has them leave the session, leave the kind of space thinking, wow, I enjoyed that, I learned something, I want to go back, I want to do it again. How do I create that connection? Well, a few tips. Firstly, own the story. So be authentic. Talk about your lived experience and express it in your own words. it's difficult to be engaging when you're talking about something that you don't fully believe in, that you don't fully understand, or that you don't fully own. So be authentic, be your true self. Of course, you know, we've just been talking about how advocacy often requires translation, depending on the situation that you're going to advocate in. You can't always be 100% your true self, depending on the space in which you're communicating, but certainly be as authentic as possible. What creates connection is the sense that, you know, that the other person is coming from a place of authenticity. Secondly, impress the listener, be memorable. In this day and age, we're so bombarded with information, constantly with kind of input, with different types of communication, that it's very difficult to make yourself memorable. And one way to do that is to think about delivering sound bites over sermons. So, you know, keep it snappy, keep it catchy, you know, use a metaphor if that makes you more memorable, use an example if that makes you more memorable. Think about what you can do to impress, to stand out. And finally, simplify and repeat. Less is more, and twice is better than once. Less is more, and twice is better than once. Not much to add to that, really, just that keep it simple, keep it clear, and repeat it if needs be. So how do we make that impression in the kind of way that we communicate, as well as the things that we're communicating? A few tips, and again, these are easier said than done. It's easy to write these things down on paper. It's difficult to do them in the moment with the adrenaline flowing. But certainly a few things that we can do are enunciate, so to speak clearly, to emphasize key words, to remember that you might be speaking to non-native speakers, or in the case of this session, for example, I'm trying to constantly bear in mind that I'm speaking to interpreters as well, and they need to have the time to translate what I'm saying. Express. Practice your lines until they sound natural. Nobody loves a robot. And again, this is about authenticity. You know, the more you can create a human connection, an organic connection with your audience, that makes them feel like they're part of a real story, a real journey, a real person's life, the easier it will be to engage them, to invite them to participate. Project. This is another very practical, very basic tip. It's better to be too loud than too quiet. And this is especially true online. People can always turn the volume down if you're speaking too loudly, but if they can't hear you, they can't hear you. So if in doubt, speak up. And the key one, relax. There's all sorts of things that we do unconsciously with our bodies that can change the way that we speak, make us harder to understand, make it more difficult to communicate with us. And the only thing we can really do is try and be conscious of those things that we do unthinkingly. Am I clenching my fists? Unclench your fists. Do I have my legs crossed? You can't see me, but as I say this, I did have my legs crossed. So I'm uncrossing them right now. Keep breathing. Of course, we breathe very differently when we're nervous, and to keep breathing, especially to keep breathing out, is key when we're speaking in public. And smile. Smiling is a fascinating trick that you can play on yourself, because smiling is something that we all do as humans, as animals, we all do when we feel happy. So the chemical kind of reactions generated by something happy are the reactions that make us smile without doing it on purpose. But we can trick our body, and if we smile, we can, and I promise this is actual scientific research, says that if we smile, we can trick our body into a reverse feedback loop where we feel some of those happy hormones, some of those happy chemicals. So smile, even if you don't feel happy, even if you don't feel relaxed, and you can feel a little bit better. Now, one of the kind of key points that always comes up in preparing for public speaking is, how do I avoid a question that I don't want to answer? And this is true for any type of public speaking. It's very true when you're being interviewed, so it's very true in relation to the media. But I think it's true of anything. Anyone can ask you a difficult question. You know, the funder who you're presenting your project to might ask you a difficult question about how you're going to run the project, or you know, the partner that you want to engage with on a certain type of advocacy might be asking you a tricky question, something that you're not allowed to talk about, or something that you don't really want to share at that moment. So there's a kind of three-part structure that I think is really helpful when we're troubleshooting, when we're kind of trying to step away from a tricky, from a dangerous area in any kind of conversation. One thing that we can do very easily, and that makes a huge difference in terms of how we react, in terms of how we come across when faced with a difficult question, is just acknowledging that question. Because the knee-jerk response, the instinctive reaction, is to pretend that we haven't heard it if we can't deal with it. But actually that doesn't look great. It doesn't look great on camera. It doesn't look great in a meeting. It doesn't look great. So the first thing that we can do to kind of make ourselves feel calmer and look better is just acknowledge that the question has been asked. And then we want to create a bridge. We want to change direction, bridge away from the thing that we don't want to focus on and back to our intention. So we want to return to our key message, to the thing that we really want to communicate. And we have a few examples here. So faced with a difficult question in whatever type of meeting, whatever you're communicating on, you might say something like, I can't comment on that. I'm acknowledging that the question has been asked. But what you should know, and these are those little bridging phrases that we want to practice, that we want to have ready, what you should know is that our work currently focuses on something else, and that's returning straight to my key message. Or we might say, I can't speak to what the Vatican has said. If the Pope, for example, has said something that's considered a little bit controversial, or someone is trying to get us to express a controversial opinion on it, we might say, I can't speak to what the Vatican has said, but, and here's our bridging phrase, the key thing to remember, and then we're back to our message, is that at Uisg, or in my congregation, or, you know, as part of this initiative. Or one more example, we can say, I'm not the best person to answer that question. We're never obliged, we're never we're never obligated to answer a question that we feel is not for us, that someone else should be taking. So you can say, I'm not the best person to answer that question. What I do know, and there's my little bridge back to my intention, back to my message, is that I'm here today to talk about such and such. Now, today, speaking is really often speaking online. So before we come to our next breakout session, I wanted to talk briefly about a few things we can do to make it easier for ourselves to present online, to speak online, just to communicate really online, which so many of us are doing so much of the time. A few key things, and again, these are simple, but kind of good to keep a list of because they're also easy to forget. Avoid interruption, find somewhere quiet where you won't be disturbed. Think about lighting. Good lighting makes a lot of difference. Make sure that your face is clearly visible and that if possible, it's evenly illuminated. The classic mistake is to sit by a window thinking that the light is good, and it's very good on one side of your face and the other side of your face is in complete darkness. That looks a little bit monstrous. So avoid interruption, find some good lighting, make eye contact. Now, this one is very difficult, and I've actually been thinking about this a lot through this very presentation, because the instinct, especially on Zoom, is to look at the face of someone that you're speaking to. So I've been looking at Patrizia here, but I know that when I look at Patrizia, I'm not looking you fully in the eye. Whereas for me, it feels very strange and a little bit counterintuitive to be looking at this little camera circle on my laptop. It doesn't feel totally natural. And of course, you don't want to be, doing that so fixedly that you're distracting yourself from the actual speaking, from the actual presentation. But it's important to remember as well that eye contact is key, that it's very difficult to make eye contact through a screen, but precisely because it's difficult, it's important to try. Body language, of course, as well as eye contact, is another key element and something that becomes harder when we're online. So remember that you're always on screen. That's an important one. You might be in a meeting, you might not have spoken for 45 minutes, you might be very bored, but you're always on screen. And remember to smile, remember to relax, do those things that can help you feel more at ease. And finally, technical issues. Prepare, rehearse, all the things that we've done before the session, but also relax, because no matter how much you prepare and no matter how much you rehearse, technology can cause some issues that you hadn't expected, and all you can do is feel at ease as you work through them. So I think we've come to the end of this part. I hope that's given us an overview of kind of what it is to communicate for advocacy, why we would do it, and then also how we would do it. A few practical tips around communicating, particularly in the public arena, particularly in the advocacy space, a few ideas on things to remember. I'm very happy to take some questions at this point. Patrizia, I don't know what the best way to do that is. Is it in chat? Will you pass the microphone?
Yes, we can also open the microphone. Julia, just to let you know that we tried to prepare the group again. And perhaps, I don't know if you have time to do both groups, so we can just reschedule or reprogram a little bit the agenda of this meeting, so we can have just one working group, perhaps.
Yeah, I think we can just go straight to the second one. I think we can just go with the questions.
Yeah, she prepared 5 people. So
okay,
we have to give more time. Yeah, that's right.
Leave a little longer, but still do the second session.
So I don't know if you want to have the questions now and then the groups, or would you prefer?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Let's have any questions on the presentation now, so that people can kind of clear up any doubts before they go into the groups.
Okay, we are a good group, so my suggestion is to write questions on the chat, but at the same time I will open the microphone, so if someone would like to take the floor, I just stopped sharing your screen, Julia, so we can have people. So you can write your questions or comments in the chat, or if you like, you can unmute your microphone and speak. You can ask the floor on the chat as you prefer. We leave you 1 minute to.
Just to thank you for this program. It's excellent. You've done very well.
Oh, thank you. This is, let me try and I can't see who's speaking, which is always a strange sensation.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay.
You should put the gallery view. Yeah.
Ah, there we go. I'm back on. Yes, there we go. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Your presentation has been excellent, very clear, and you've been a perfect example of all that you have said.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the feedback, and I'm glad it's been useful.
There is a question in the chat, Julia.
Yes. Can you share some positive or negative experience of communicating on advocacy? Oh, great question. Absolutely. So I think we've had a very positive experience of communicating for advocacy around the work that sisters are doing globally, the work that sisters have been doing during the pandemic and kind of since the start of the pandemic, and also the work that sisters do generally. I think one thing that we found as part of this project is that sisters are an absolute kind of gold mine of incredible stories, incredible witness to some really important, really crucial issues in terms of human development around the world. And it's been a great joy and a great privilege to start sharing some of those stories. So that's been a very positive experience. In terms of negative experiences, that's a very good question. I'm not sure that the project has has been around long enough for us to have had any very negative experiences so far. So I think I'm going to keep that in mind, and if anything comes up, let you know. Certainly, I mean, perhaps I can talk about this on a more personal level. I've had some negative experiences of communicating, particularly kind of speaking in meetings, at kind of presentations, where I felt like I had not quite understood the point of the meeting. So I think a typical negative experience can be around kind of feeling like you didn't quite have all the cards in your hand. You didn't quite know what was kind of in the deck of cards, and suddenly you're dealt a card that you hadn't expected, or you find that there are people in the meeting that you didn't realize would be there, or you understand that actually people have had a conversation previously that you weren't part of, and that's changed the agenda. I think feeling unprepared can be a very scary thing when we speak publicly, when we communicate on anything. And it's something that can really throw you off course. I've had negative experiences of feeling like I'd lost the plot, lost control of the situation because I hadn't been well prepared. Either, sometimes it was my fault, sometimes it wasn't, but feeling unprepared is something that can be scary. And I think you can only learn from experience on that. It happens to the best of us, it happens to all of us, and you just learn those things that you can practice with yourself to keep relaxed, to keep yourself at ease, and to kind of work through the difficulties. I'm going to look at a few other questions.
Yeah, there is one in Spanish. Right?
I see that, yes. So, yes, we were talking about kind of being friendly, being approachable to someone who is shy, who is perhaps more nervous, and being perhaps more reserved when you're faced with someone who is stronger, who has their own agenda. I'm hearing some background noise, by the way. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, I'm solving.
No problem. So yes, I can talk about that a bit more. I think the point that I was trying to get across was about how we can wear different masks. And the idea of a mask is a tricky one, because of course we've just been talking about authenticity. We do want to be our true selves. And the more we are our true selves, the more we can engage, the more we can connect with others. But I guess rather than a mask, the analogy I want is perhaps we can wear different hats, so we can kind of communicate in a certain role, in a certain manner that puts us in a certain position relative to our audience, and we can choose that role, we can choose that manner, we can decide the hat that we wear. And I think it's very important to think about kind of, are we in a situation where we're the person who is going to struggle the most to relax? So am I focused on doing the things that are going to make me feel good, that are going to make me feel calm? Am I focused on kind of making sure that I'm in control of the situation? Or is there someone else who is actually more nervous than me? Is there someone else who actually needs a bit of reassurance? Because sometimes we can go into a particular communication arena sort of armed for battle a little bit, ready to defend our own idea, ready to communicate our own message. And what's required is more empathy. What's required is understanding that the other person too might come from a place of nervousness. So I hope that answers the question. The idea is to really balance what I need to feel comfortable in a situation where I'm communicating with what the other person might need, and to try and hold those things in balance, depending a little bit on the kind of dynamics of power as well in that situation.
Julia, could you please, in case, read the question, because otherwise we don't know which question you answered to. I think there is one which is very interesting. In a situation or countries where people are afraid to speak up for fear of being labeled, how best can we practice advocacy?
Yes, in a situation or countries where people are afraid to speak up, how can we practice advocacy? That's a great question. And it speaks to what we were just saying about what we were just saying about advocating where you are. You know, we're all in different situations. We all experience very different lived realities. So I think a key element here, and something that we really want to emphasize as part of this project, is that you might not be able to speak up. Sometimes doing advocacy requires work behind the scenes because the situation that you're in puts you in danger if you speak up, if you step out on the stage. And that's okay. That's kind of part of the bigger advocacy picture. The key thing that we've found in conversations with sisters is that the global kind of connectedness is key. So you might be unable to speak up, but someone can speak up at a more global level on the particular challenges that you face in your country, in your area. And because they're at a kind of different level, in a different place, they can speak up without fear of repercussion. That's kind of one aspect. So you don't always have to speak up. There are different ways, kind of quieter ways, ways that are more subtle sometimes, that you can start creating change without being seen, without exposing yourself to danger. But the other side of that is that you can start small. You can start fermenting a culture of advocacy. Perhaps you can find those 2 or 3 like-minded people who would be on board if they understood what you're doing. You don't have to put yourself out immediately into the public arena where you know you will be labeled. Sometimes you can start with a small group, with just one ally, one person who, you know, gets the change that you're working towards and wants to help. And sometimes it doesn't require, you know, a big statement. Public speaking doesn't necessarily require kind of switching on your megaphone and reaching as many people as possible right away. Sometimes it can be about slowly but surely, you know, shifting the culture, one connection, one person at a time. And that's where that human connection is really, really important. Maybe you don't have a stage right now, it's too dangerous, or you would be labeled, ostracized, but you can whisper in the ear of the one person sitting next to you who is most likely to agree. So it's kind of about finding different ways to do it that don't put you at risk. Patrizia, are there any other questions that you?
Yes, there are.
I can see them.
Yeah. But you know, there is another one. In the beginning, you spoke about a sense of human dignity. Why a sense?
So I think the way that that's phrased in the advocacy vision statement is just intended to convey that we want everyone to experience a sense of human dignity, whether that's their own human dignity, but also the human dignity of others. So I think what we're trying to say is we could have said we want everyone to experience human dignity. But what we also want is for everyone to experience the sense of the human dignity of others. And that's why we chose the word sense, because it is relational. It is about people in themselves, but also with each other.
I now ask you 2 other questions. One is in Spanish and one in Italian. So we also respect the different languages participation. And the first one is, muchas gracias, excelente la presentación.
Thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation, and I want to know if there are limits regarding advocacy. And the second question is in Italian, and a sister who's a journalist
to the times of the various media,
regarding the different types
are
of
there
media,
cautions to have, or
what is the principle that we should
less is more
always
is always
apply?
valid?
Should we
What do you
always apply
think?
the principle less is more? Is that always valid, or is it not, depending on the situation? Are there limits for the advocacy work? Well, that's a great question. I think that we have never asked ourselves this question. There can be limits. That would be my answer. Surely what happens when we do advocacy work is that sometimes we need practice, we need time time that we could perhaps use to do some practical things in a given situation. Or it requires time that we could be using to give an immediate response in an emergency situation. But advocacy has an element, something that has to do with a systemic approach. And when we look at things from the point of view of the systemic organization, sometimes we lose sight of some very concrete and real details. So my answer would be that sometimes we can't look at things in the long term. We have to
As
give
for
immediate
the
answers to
times
very
of the various
concrete
media,
questions. Now, is it always true that
well, this
less
is a
is
good
more?
question.
Regarding the
As for the times
different
of the various media, it is true
and
that
their
there are some
times,
spaces
it is
in which
definitely true
it is important
that
indeed to
sometimes it is
go in a
important
deeper
to look
analysis
at
of
certain
some
issues in
topics
depth.
because it
And it
is
is
crucial
extremely
to take
important to
advantage
make
of
the
the
most of
spaces,
some
of
spaces and
these larger spaces
situations
when
when we
they
can
exist,
look at things
because
in
the
depth.
media landscape and information
Because in
landscape
general,
is a one
in the
in
media, we
which
don't
these
have a lot of
spaces
space
are
to
really
look at
few.
things
So
in
when
depth.
they
So
exist,
when
it
we
would be
have
important.
Non so, qualcuno scriveva nella chat, possiamo verificare, forse Giulia, so se vuoi tornare all'inglese siamo più tranquille,
Sure.
forse.
I'll
So, attenzione alle interpreti, gentilmente, se cambiano lingua devono cambiare anche la sala. Grazie. Vai Giulia in inglese.
Sorry about that. Sorry about the confusion. So I think that, yes, where we do kind of find, especially in the media space, that we have time, that we have the opportunity to go more in depth, then I think it is important to take that opportunity. I think less is more as a tip, as a kind of buzzword, refers more to the way that we communicate than to what we communicate. So less is more in the sense that simplicity is vital. Less is more in the sense that it's better to communicate one concept clearly than three concepts in a way that's confusing. Less is more in the how, in the way that we do things. But certainly at a time when information is rapid fire, and spaces to communicate, particularly within the media, tend to be focused on sound bites only. If we do find a space to communicate more in depth, then of course that's crucial too.
Thank you, Julia. I'm not reading the questions that are more focused on advocacy because today is more on communication for advocacy. So I'm selecting the questions more on communication because you will tell us that we will have another webinar on on advocacy and other initiative that Uta and you are planning on advocacy and to inform the sisters. I want to ask you one question, which is very interesting. It's in Italian.
Yes.
Come gestire
How to manage advocacy in the face of cultures whose rhythm is different in communication processes.
I'm going to stick with the English just for the sake of for the sake of sanity and for the translators. That is a really interesting question because advocacy is about change, as we were saying. And so it is inevitably a process that is kind of located in time. In some contexts, that change can happen more quickly, and in some contexts, that change will happen incredibly slowly. And depending on the context that we come from, we can be more or less comfortable in one place or in another. Now, I think that's particularly true and particularly relevant to communication around advocacy. There are situations in which you can communicate something and expect it to be picked up straight away. Cultural contexts in which you know that you might communicate your systemic vision, your policy suggestion, whatever it is, and know that there is kind of that there is groundwork that has been done, that the ground has been prepared for that communication to progress rapidly. And other situations where you can start talking about this and have to engage for weeks or months or years before any actual change can happen. So I think the only way to deal with that is with extreme radical empathy. The only way to deal with that is by kind of locating yourself firmly at the empathy end of the spectrum and thinking, okay, no matter what my message is, this change is not going to happen without engagement. So if the engagement is the key, then I have to start from where my audience is at.
Giulia, io selezionerei, se tu sei d'accordo, I'm speaking Italian, 2 other questions, one from the French and one in English. And then perhaps we can have a very short break, and then we will try to start the working groups. So you can give us some of the directions before we go. We take a break also for our interpreters, and then we can take a time for the working groups and then come back here, and perhaps we can recuperate also some questions from the chat. Is that okay with you?
Yes, I was just going to say, if you like, we can after this just kind of quickly share the instructions for the groups and then do that, because that will also be a break for the interpreter. And so then
it's perfect. So the question in French, I will read it in Italian to facilitate the interpreters. Per l'advocacy, vorrei sapere.
For advocacy, I would like to know if sensitization is a preparation phase for advocacy.
Such a good question. So I would say that awareness raising, sensibilizzazione, comes under the umbrella of the mobilization and empowerment pillar. I would say that idea of mobilization and empowerment as one of the key activities of advocacy also includes raising awareness. It is, of course, something that you can do as part of other advocacy activities. Certainly your communication might be aimed at raising awareness, or your research might be aimed at raising awareness. But I think that as a general kind of thematic area, awareness raising is part of that sense that advocacy is also about mobilizing, because mobilizing really means to get people moving, right? That's what mobilizing means. And to get people moving, they have to know the thing that you are trying to communicate. They have to know why they should move. So I think, yes, awareness raising is very much a kind of preparatory activity in the area of mobilization, and then empowerment, all those things around engagement and kind of community building as well.
Thank you, Giulia. Before the English question, just a clarification for James, that actually in Spanish we use incidencia. We do not use advocacia. So if the interpreter are using this word, they can change it with incidencia. Thank you, James. And the last question comes from a Cueca communication office in Africa. How can sisters get the media to be on their side and vice versa in relation to their advocacy work?
Well, the good news is our experience of the project so far is that it's not too difficult to get the media on side. And the reason for that is, I would say globally, the media doesn't know very much about what sisters do. That may be more or less true depending on the type of media, depending on the context, but certainly there's a whole world out there, a whole mediatic, journalistic world that really doesn't understand what sisters do in their day-to-day lives and what they might be advocating for. And I think the impression that we've had from the kind of, as I say, the first year of this project is that when people discover what sisters are doing, they're amazed, they're excited, they're astounded by all this incredible work that's happening, and by kind of all the knowledge that sisters have, the witness that they bear, the experience that they can share. So I think, as we were saying before, in any communication, the magic happens in the space where two agendas intersect. you have an agenda, you have things that you want to share, you have change that you want to create. And the media, the specific journalists, the media outlet, whoever it is, they have their own agenda too. They want to sell a good story. They want to, share something exciting. They want a good, a catchy title for their article, whatever it is they want. And I think there's a lot of leeway in that space. There's a lot of room for maneuver where those two agendas can intersect, because what sisters do is incredibly exciting to the world that knows nothing about it. So I think it's just about kind of trying out different things and seeing what sticks, what gets more of a reaction. And again, those things that we've talked about, it's about authenticity. Journalists want to hear, a real story, a real lived experience. It's about creating that connection and trying out different ways of doing that.
Wow, we can continue actually, because there are other questions. So it's important. So there is really a need to go more in depth with this theme. So the plan that we are having, Uta and Julia, is right, the right one. So Julia, if you can give us the instructions for the group, in case the group do not start for technical problem that we are trying to solve, we can change our program for today, okay? So
sure, absolutely. Okay, so let me just go back to sharing my screen very briefly so that we have the instructions on the screen. Right, so in this second breakout session, you will have slightly longer to prepare, 10 minutes, because what I would love you to prepare is an actual trial run of a presentation. So I would love you to think about an advocacy initiative that you would like to launch, or that you would like to join, or that you would like to allocate some more resources to, something that you can do connected to your work. It could be writing about it, talking about it, doing some more research on a particular topic, finding some partners who would be interested in the same thing. Anything that kind of falls under our 5 pillars of advocacy. And I would love you to think about an advocacy initiative. Could be related to something you've already done in the past, or it could be something totally new, could be something at the local level, with the school that you're in, or kind of something with your local community, but it could also be something more regional, working with sisters who do the same thing in another country. And to think about kind of who you're giving this little presentation to. So would it be a superior who can allocate time, who can allocate someone to help you? Would it be a funder? Do you need some support to do this financially? Would it be a partner, an NGO that might be doing a similar thing, or someone you can do this with as part of an interfaith group, or any kind of person, any kind of stakeholder who might be needing to hear about this initiative that you want to promote. And the initiative, as we were saying, we have the 5 pillars here on the right, but it could be anything. It could be a small campaign. It could be a meeting that you'd like to set up. It could be a policy document that you would like to write. You might like to get an article published in a magazine and you're pitching it to the journalist. It could be anything at all. Think as broadly as you like. So we're going to go into breakout groups. Now, the breakout groups are now of 5 people each, more or less 4 or 5 people. So I think what we're going to allocate is 25 minutes for the breakout session, if that's all right. And that will be, in fact, sorry, Patrizia, I think we should allocate half an hour, because then that's 5 minutes each to speak. And it would be great then to take 5 minutes to share very briefly what struck you, what stood out, what you enjoyed in the presentations of others. Is that okay?
Yes. So Teresa, per Teresa sono 30 minuti il tempo dei gruppi.
Teresa,
we know
the
that
session breakout groups.
Previous commitments, so do not worry. We will record the session of the final session, but we will have also other meetings in the future, other workshops. And so now we can give 5 minutes, right? A break.
Yes, let's give 5 minutes now, and then if it's half an hour, then we'll have 10 minutes to the end of the session. So yes, that's perfect.
Okay, so you have 5 minutes of break, so you can go to take a coffee or something, but then you will be directly in the group. In case that the technical problem is not solved, you will be back here again, and we will try to manage the other session. Is that okay? We will be here to answer your question or problems in case for the group. So take 5 minutes break, and then we will be back in the groups. Okay, thank you.
Apro le sale.
Sì, Teresa, così vediamo se funzionano.
No.
Niente, non funziona, no? È interessante proprio. Noi che
Ora.
insegniamo agli altri come funziona Zoom. We teach others how to use Zoom and we have problems. It's a shame.
Flo.
Flo.
What she say?
No, the only way it's to close e di chiudere e di riaprire.
La
non possiamo,
sala?
no, non possiamo chiudere, no, non fa nulla, non facciamo i gruppi, perché poi se le persone non rientrano, no, non mi sembra, siamo troppi, capito? Diventa veramente difficile da gestire. Ma da che cosa può essere dipeso, Flo? Da questo fatto che io e lei siamo entrate con lo stesso account?
Sì, punto.
Solo la prossima volta, va bene.
Facciamo attenzione.
E dopo tutto si blocca e tu non puoi fare nulla.
Ai, mon Dio. Questo è terribile. Ce lo dobbiamo ricordare per le prossime volte, perché molti di noi hanno usiamo lo stesso account, quindi...
Sì, ma tu ricordi, l'ho detto.
Sì, oggi mi è proprio sfuggito. So, Giulia, i gruppi... non ti sento? Ecco, adesso sì. I gruppi, niente, è un problema tecnico che non possiamo risolvere, purtroppo. Dovremmo uscire, dovremmo chiudere l'evento e rientrare di nuovo. A questo punto dell'orario mi sembra inopportuno. Quindi se tu puoi pensare... You have the flow.
Wonderful. So, to everybody who is still here, I would love to, since we did a great, I really enjoyed our brainstorming earlier in the session, I would love to hear about one thing that you've learned. So 1 word, 2 words, 3 words. We've talked about what advocacy is in 1 word. So it would be great to hear one thing that's new, that surprised you, that you weren't expecting, one thing that you've learned today that might be more memorable, because that's what we're hoping, right? To communicate memorably. And I'm going to stop sharing so that I can follow along with what people are writing in the chat. Tell us one thing that's been surprising, that's been novel. Mobilization. Hi, Sister Donatus. And thank you for that. I'd just be interested to hear kind of what of this is more or less new, you know, anything that, anything that struck you as, oh, I hadn't thought of that. I'd never reflected on it in that way. Troubleshooting, yes, it's good to have those kind of techniques up your sleeve so that when difficult situations arise, you have the methods in place to move away from difficult questions. Thank you for joining us, to everyone who is leaving shortly or is leaving now. It's been great. The empathy spectrum. Yes, that's something that actually I hadn't thought about until I started putting together the presentation. It's one of those kind of, empathy is one of those elements of communication that many of us practice without realizing it. And so I think there's always that interesting exercise of making explicit something that is usually implicit. Of course, empathy is a vital part of communication for all of us, but do we think about how we use it and kind of how it relates to other elements of our communication? And the troubleshooting, yes, I'm glad that that was helpful. And yes, so advocacy within a congregation, advocacy as part of our ministry, networking for systemic change, yes, all of those all of those are really things that we're learning as we go along. And that's the great thing about this project is, you know, it's all a process of kind of sharing, learning, and creating that feedback loop of ideas, of reflections where we can all learn from each other. Because so much of what we've said today is actually kind of the result of the last 9 months of learning. Prepare, connect, impress, troubleshoot, yes. And yes, so raising awareness, being authentic. Yes. Hi, Sister Victoria. Hola, muy buenas. ¿Qué tal? Pues sí, pensar que la incidencia a veces no debe ser tan directa, sino en evolución.
Yes, so also it's important to think that advocacy can't be direct all the time.
And empowerment, listening as part of advocacy. Yes, that's something that I've actually made a note on today. We kind of think so much about speaking, about raising our voice as part of communication, but listening is so key, so crucial. Building confidence, yes, fighting, being organized to fight, because the challenges that we fight are so well organized, so global. Making an impression, being strong in our intention, advocating where we are. Thank you. It's so great to be reading all these inputs, all these different ideas on what's been new. So Patrizia, I'll scroll back and take a couple more questions if that's helpful. Or I don't know if, yeah. It's tricky to find the so much great content has gone into the chat that it's difficult to find.
Yeah.
I can help you. Where we want to pick up. Yeah, let me know if there's any that you'd spotted that we want to.
Yes, there were a couple about advocacy and some other. Yeah, I'm sorry that other people had to leave because they had other meetings, you know. Okay, this is interesting. Can you practice advocacy when you talk to people who do not trust the facts? Should you try to convince them? If yes, how? This is a huge theme.
Yes, it's a topic for a workshop unto itself, for a whole other webinar.
Right.
Can you advocate to people who don't trust the facts? Isn't that $1 million question? And it's a very topical question, of course, in this age of disinformation, in the age of fake news. What do we do about creating change when the facts are in dispute? I think that, I really do think that we should do a whole other workshop on this, actually, because the short answer is there are ways to connect with people who don't want to hear the facts. Often people don't want to hear the facts, not because they distrust the facts for any particular reason, but because their assessment of the facts, their engagement with the facts is completely blocked by an emotion, by a feeling, by a belief, by something else that is kind of blocking their engagement with fact, with truth. So sometimes engaging with those people is not about hitting them with more facts. You know, sometimes in the face of those people faced with that resistance, we can be tempted to say, no, but look at this evidence, look at that evidence, look at these numbers. All of these things are true. And we can get more and more frustrated that that person is just not listening. And actually, often it's not about more, it's about less. Like we've said before, less can be more. And that's true in this situation as well. Sometimes it's not about providing more facts, more evidence. It's about removing something, thinking more critically, thinking more astutely about the barrier, about the blockage. What is it that's stopping that person from engaging with my facts? So I think the answer is it is possible to do that. There's a whole series of techniques, and that really is kind of a whole other area of communicational expertise. But that is possible. It can be done. I think it's also, though, important to acknowledge that sometimes it's not possible in this particular moment to engage someone who doesn't believe in our facts, or it's not possible, with the resources that we have. You know, it takes more time than we can invest, more energy than we have available at this moment. And it is also about setting those boundaries. You know, where do I invest my energies? What am I willing to spend on this person, on this particular communication, on this particular piece of advocacy? Is it worth the effort that I'm making? And I think we've all had that experience. I mean, I want to say as women, you know, so many of us have had that experience of finding that our truth, our factual, empirical truth of what it means to live in the world as a woman, and the discrimination that we can sometimes face, you know, sometimes we encounter audiences who just will not hear it. They will not treat it as fact. and that can be so frustrating. And I certainly, you know that feeling, and I've come to learn that sometimes you just have to say, this person is not hearing me, and I can't make them. So it's kind of about, yeah, balancing that, finding new techniques, but also deciding when to just cut your losses.
I'm sorry for the Acueca communication officer. She couldn't hear your answer about. So we will send the recording of the webinar so they can listen to it again. I want to read the comment. It's a comment, a question, very interesting. Is the balance of intention and empathy also similar to balance between charity and justice?
Wow, it's similar because I love a good spectrum, and I love to illustrate my metaphors in this kind of, you know, balancing two things kind of way. So certainly to me, it feels similar in the way that I think about it. Is it actually comparable? I would say that there are definitely points of comparison. I hadn't thought about it. It wasn't part of my kind of design for the presentation. But certainly I think, you know, there is that sense that charity is about the immediate need of another. So in that sense, it is perhaps could be located at the empathy end of that other spectrum. Charity is about saying, you know, I see this other person, this is what they need, this is, you know, I encounter them in this moment in their life, and I give, because from, you know, from what I have, this is what I can give, and this is how I meet their need. So it's a much more, it's comparable to empathy in the sense that it's that it's more of a gut reaction, right? That it's more of a, it's more immediate, it's more organic sometimes, it's more unfiltered sometimes. Whereas certainly justice has to be about intention, because it requires us to abstract slightly or more than slightly from that level of the gut reaction, and to say, okay, this is how I might respond immediately, but what am I going to do beyond that? What am I aiming for in the long term? So in that sense, certainly I would say that justice is located at the more intentional, the more rational, in inverted commas, the kind of, more abstract end of that spectrum. So I think that's a super interesting comparison. Thank you very much.
Julia, I call you sister. Julia, I have another question. I think it's wide, but I think it's interesting. I'm wondering, which way can we overcome challenges of advocacy, especially the challenge of knowing our allies and knowing our frenemies?
Ooh, how can we overcome the challenges, especially knowing our allies and knowing our frenemies? So I think a lot of overcoming those challenges that we looked at is really about reflection and preparation. So when it comes to those first two challenges, the internal aspect of how do I communicate with a new audience while kind of retaining my essence, being true to myself, and the external side of that same coin, you know, how do I engage with new audiences without alienating the people who supported me before? I think those challenges are about preparation. They're about kind of reflecting before we enter a certain arena, before we communicate in a certain way. Inevitably, they're also about trial and error. They're about learning from experience. But I think that kind of attentive reflection and detail, you know, can make all the difference. Because sometimes it's, you know, sometimes there's a particular word that's particularly triggering for a certain audience, or, you know, there's a particular way that I've expressed myself. All it takes is one sentence, you know, to make my audience feel like, ooh, that's not, you know, that's not what they were expecting. That's not what they're comfortable with. So unfortunately, it is something that really lies in the details, in the kind of minutiae of the way that we communicate. And all we can do is be prepared and then learn from our mistakes, because inevitably there are mistakes. In terms of the other two challenges, so building our platform, owning the spotlight, and then knowing our allies and our frenemies. I think some of that is about, I think a lot of that is about sincerity. You know, to build strong partnerships, you really need to be honest. You need to be upfront about what you want. And again, when you think about frenemies as well, it's the same, you know, being sincere with yourself and with others about where your agenda lies, what you want to achieve. And in a way, thinking as well about how communication can sometimes be transactional, right? Especially when we think about the media, and this is something that we looked at in the last session in December. You know, I give you something and you give me something in return. Often communication involves a transaction of that sort. So with the media, you're giving the journalist a great story that they can sell. They're giving you a platform to speak. So in what way and to what extent, to what point do those two agendas, do those two interests overlap? And I think being very clear with yourself and with others about what you want, what you need to get out of a certain transaction is very helpful, because you can set clear boundaries, you can set clear expectations, and you can be, you know, prepared to push back where your frenemies are actually kind of throwing you off course, diverting you from the things that you wanted to achieve.
Julia, there is another question. I think it's very important and perhaps might be the final, which bridges you and Uta for the final and the conclusion.
Right.
How could we best engage a network with the Uisg in researches on specific issues with regards to international laws convention to hold member states accountable to correct unjust laws and policies?
Wow, Sister Donatus, that really is a question that will probably take us the whole 2 years of this project to answer. How can we engage and network with Uisg in research on specific issues with regards to international laws or conventions to hold member states accountable? So I think that one thing that the project is grappling with is kind of working out at the moment is how we're going to translate this global vision for advocacy to the more local, national level. And I think we have a big piece of work to do around kind of how we make sure that this vision for advocacy that is global, and we want it to stay global, but how we translate that to working on specific issues with specific states, you know, to correct, to kind of change specific laws and policies. I, to be totally honest, don't have an immediate answer to that. I think that the best way to network with Uisg on these things is to stay involved with the project. So as Patrizia was saying, that is a great bridge to our final slide, to our conclusion, because really the more we can kind of build a community, build a network of sisters who are involved in advocacy and stay up to date with what they're doing, the more we can work out this particularly difficult point of how are we translating our global vision to specific actions, specific kind of you know, movements for change at the national level. Patrizia, I'm going to share my final slide then, and what I'm going to put in the chat is the feedback form, which Uta has kindly created for us. So here we are at the conclusion of the session, and it has been so fun and so exciting. I'm sad to conclude, actually, but in just one moment, I'm going to put a very short feedback form in the chat in all 4 languages, and it would be great if everyone could take a couple of minutes just to fill that in and pop it back to Uta so that we can get your thoughts on this session. Before I do that, I wanted to highlight two very important events, two ways that you can stay in touch with what we're doing. One is to look out for part 2 of our Sisterhood Works campaign, which will be running on April 28th. This will be on the Uisg voice channels, and I will put those in the chat in just a moment as well. So on April 28th, we will be sharing more stories of how sisters are working in service of local communities around the world. We've already received a huge number of amazing contributions, so we're really excited to share them all, and we would love for you to kind of share those stories that we'll be posting. If you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, follow us, speak to the people in your networks about this event, and make sure that kind of the campaign reaches as widely as possible. And then the next session that we will all be at, and that we very much hope to be seeing you at, is the final Sisters Empowering Women session on July the 15th. Patrizia has been running a series of Sisters Empowering Women events, which you may already know about. And the next one, am I right, Patrizia? The next one is on April 27th.
Exactly.
Yes, April 27th. So you can join all of those sessions. You can find out more on the Uisg website, on the Uisg channels, about the meeting on April 27th. And each meeting in this Sisters Empowering Women series is on a different topic. And the final topic will be advocacy on July the 15th. So we very much hope that you will be there. And of course, there will be more information nearer the time. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who's here. To everyone who's joined in, who's shared their ideas, contributions, questions. If you have any more questions for me, you have my email address here. So feel free to take a screenshot, take a photo, copy it down. I will put in the chat my email address, the Uisg voice channels where we're sharing our advocacy work, and the feedback form. And I will be here for 5 minutes while people answer their feedback form before we say goodbye, if that sounds okay, Patrizia.
Yes, Julia, there is an observation in the chat that I just want to give you, and perhaps this is a way to also clarify this point, that perhaps how the Uisg campaign on Laudato Si and in integral ecology, sowing hope for the planet, is connected with this project, and how we can give more visibility, so you will tell us more during the following events. So now, just for you to know.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question. And of course, one of the key things here is advocacy is built on work on the ground, as our vision statement says. So what we want to be doing in terms of the way that we're working within Uisg is connecting this project to all the other amazing projects that already exist, Sowing Hope for the Planet, and of course Talitha Kum, and the other projects that have been set up more recently. So one of the key things that we're doing is working out where it all fits together. And as Patrizia said, hopefully on July the 15th, we will have a clear idea of that and can share more about it. So thank you very much. Please do take a moment to click. Oh no, hang on. I've put the, I've sent the, there we go. I've sent the feedback forms to the wrong part of the chat. So I'm popping them in the chat again now. There we go, here they are.
So the way it works, just to say very briefly, there's nothing you need to send back. You open the link, you fill in the form, it goes automatically to me. So nothing that you need to do, just fill it in. And thank you very much for that.
Yes, so fill it in and click submit at the end, right? Otherwise it doesn't, you don't just fill it in, you do click submit so that we get it back. Amazing. So while people are doing that, is there anything else that I need to say? I was going to copy in the Uisg voice channels, which I will do right now.
Julia, while you do that, I want to thank you and Uta for being here, for sharing your expertise, and to help us. I think all of us felt more empowered because you give us energy, your inputs, that we can do something as women and religious and consecrated people, and we can really change the reality. So thank you very much to both of you, especially to you, for sharing your skills in communication.
Thank you, Patrizia. Thank you for hosting. Thank you for organizing. And yeah, thank you everyone for being.
We are not hosting you. You are part of the Uisg.
Well, your incredible technical skills have hosted this, this session, so I'm very grateful for that. Here is the Uisg Twitter channel in the chat.
I think that also by tonight, we will be able to offer the recordings in the 4 languages on the Uisg YouTube channel. If you don't know how to reach the YouTube channel, you go on our website, uisg.org, and up above there is the links. There are the links to the social media. And you will find the recordings of the 4 languages there.
Great. I think we can say goodbye. Is there anything I've missed?
Yes, I think so, even though we like to be here together.
Yes.
So we can stay. Oh, I can unmute all people so we can just thank and